Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Judson Brewer, who will talk to us about unwinding anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. Judson Brewer, MD, Ph.D., is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center. He is also an associate professor in behavioral and social sciences at Brown School of Public Health and psychiatry at Brown University's Medical School. Additionally, he is a research affiliate at MIT. A psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions, Brewer has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for behavioral change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. For more on his extensive credentials, please see our website or the back of today's order of service. We welcome Dr. Judd Brewer. Dr. Judd, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to join you all this morning, and I thought we'd just jump right in. I'll give a little bit of a presentation, hopefully more of a conversation starter for us. I'll use a few slides and some videos to hit some key points, and I'll just go ahead and get started. So just to get some of the disclosures out of the way. So Brown University manages all of my conflicts of interest. The apps, one of the apps that I'll be mentioning today is owned by a company called ShareCare that I have stock in. But I thought I would start, and also I have a book called Unwinding Anxiety that I get royalties from. But I thought I would start with a story of a patient that I had seen over the last couple of years who was referred to me for anxiety. Anxiety has skyrocketed over the last couple of years, and we'll talk about why that's the case. But this patient had actually come to see me before the pandemic began. And I'm showing a picture of somebody driving on the highway because he used to get panic attacks driving on the highway, feeling like he was in a speeding bullet. Long story short, he not only had panic disorder, but he also had generalized anxiety disorder, which is basically anxiety throughout the day. And he'd had this probably for about 30 years. So with patients like this, how can I help them? I'm using this cartoon. It says, have you tried worrying about it? Because the medications that we use that I prescribe for anxiety aren't particularly great. There's a metric called the number needed to treat, which gives us a sense for how well any particular treatment will work for any particular condition. For medications, the best medications that we have for anxiety, that number needed to treat is 5.2, which means for every 5 patients I prescribe medication to, only one of them shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So 5 patients, 1 benefits, which is pretty anxiety provoking for me. It basically means that I'm playing the medication lottery. I don't know which of my 5 patients that I prescribe medication to is going to benefit, and I'm not sure how to help the others. Now, personally, I've suffered from anxiety myself. I used to get panic attacks during residency. But I also noticed that, I struggled when I started meditating about 25 years ago, and I struggled with trying to force myself to not, to have my attention stay on my breath, not have my mind wander. And the reason I bring that forward is that I had been trying to use this willpower-based approach to force myself to concentrate. And in the same way, many of the techniques that are offered to patients to help them with anxiety are basically using their willpower, just telling them to stop. I mean, it's a little more complex than that, but basically saying, just overcome your anxiety. And as Einstein is attributed to have said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And what I mean by this is that we rely on our prefrontal cortex to help us use cognitive control over things, to try to manage things. And the problem is that this is the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get anxious or we get stressed. It's the youngest and it's the weakest part of our brain. So why are we relying on it to help us with anxiety or even other, overcoming other habits? So I'm going to give you a 4-minute primer on how the brain works so that we can start to think differently about how we can work with anxiety. And this will, and what I would suggest before I get into this is that we haven't really focused on how the brain works. So let's dive in right now.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next, and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us, and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits. But this is only the first step. To hack our brains and break the anxiety cycle, we need to become aware of two things. One, that we are getting anxious or panicking, and two, what the result is.
So from here, hopefully that gives you a primer on how this system works in our brain. System's called reward-based learning. It takes three elements, as you saw from the animation: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. And as you saw from the animation, it helps us survive through what's called negative reinforcement when we step out of the way of on a busy sidewalk or a busy street. But it also is set up to help us remember where food is. We see food, we eat the food, and then our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So how can anxiety actually get set up as a habit? This was a big surprise to me. I hadn't really learned this in medical school or residency, but in my lab, I'd been studying habit change. We'd worked with programs. We developed an app called Eat Right Now to help people with overeating and stress eating. And somebody in that program said, anxiety is actually triggering me to eat. Could you develop a program for anxiety? I hadn't really thought about that because I generally had been trained to prescribe medications. But when I looked back at the literature, there's actually a very robust literature suggesting that anxiety can be driven like any other habit. I'm going to show you a very brief animation. This is actually from our Unwinding Anxiety app that explains how this process works.
We'll talk more about the neuroscience of our brains in a bit, but for now, let's focus specifically on how habits around anxiety are formed. We'll call it the habit loop. First, something happens in your life. It could be good or bad. It's called a trigger. For example, what does it feel like when something good happens in your life? Let's use getting a funny text or watching a cute video on your phone as an example. Your brain says, oh, that feels good. Do that some more, so you can keep that good feeling going. So your brain lays down this memory. Oh, next time you want to feel good, you should do that again. Now you start to associate that behavior with feeling good. The next time you hear that alert on your phone, that triggers your brain to act. Oh, I should check my phone. The more you do this, getting an alert on your phone, leading you to watch a cute video, leading you to feel good, the more this gets laid down as a habit loop. Trigger, behavior, reward. This works with negative emotions too. Have you ever just thought about how far behind you are on your to-do list? Or beaten yourself up for making a mistake or missing a deadline at school or work? How does that feel? Not so good, is it? Just like we want to have more good feelings, we want bad feelings to go away as quickly as possible. So what do we do when this happens? We get triggered by that thought or emotion and go and do something on our phones to feel better. This too lays down a memory. If you're stressed or anxious, distract yourself. You'll feel better. The more we do this, get anxious, which leads to distracting ourselves, which leads to feeling a little bit better, the more this too becomes a habit. Trigger, behavior, reward. Now, do you have stress or anxiety that seems to trigger more anxiety, feeding on itself? This might become its own type of habit loop. For example, you think of all the things you have to do today. Then you start to worry that you can't possibly get everything done. And that stressful thought triggers more worry thoughts. This goes on and on as you tighten down into a tiny ball of anxiety. In this case, stress itself can easily become a trigger for out-of-control anxiety. Instead of stress triggering us to get our to-do list done so we feel better, it triggers out-of-control worry thinking. Getting caught up in worry thinking becomes the new behavior in the habit loop. The result? We contract down into that tight little ball of anxiety. That's not much of a reward, is it? So there can be two types of habit loops that can be happening here. The one in which the behavior of doing something, like distracting ourselves, can make us feel a little bit better, and the one where the behavior is out of control thinking that just gets us all knotted up in a ball of anxiety. No matter which habit loop it is, what's tricky is that the more you get caught up in these behaviors, the more automatic they become. Over time, you're not even consciously choosing these actions anymore. It's like you're on autopilot. You're not even flying the plane.
So as a psychiatrist, I started realizing that my patients don't learn to get anxious in my office. And in fact, my patients that want to quit smoking or stop overeating, they don't learn those behaviors in my office either. So I started thinking of ways that we could develop programs to help people in their own context, because this is where these habits form. And as I was looking into this, I was studying mindfulness training, doing some studies with helping people with addictions, and finding that it was working pretty well. For example, in one randomized controlled trial we did with smoking cessation, we got 5 times better quit rates at smoking cessation, helping people quit smoking, than the gold standard treatment. So we started asking, well, could mindfulness actually help? And could we develop this as an app-based treatment so that people could get it in context? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term mindfulness. Jon Kabat-Zinn had popularized it back in the 1970s when he developed a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. He talks about paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. I really think of this as bringing awareness to whatever's happening and being curious about it rather than just assuming we know what's going to happen. And that's where anxiety can really ramp up. If we're like, something happens, we have a feeling of anxiety and we start to worry, oh no, that can actually just ramp it up. So we decided to develop this digital therapeutic, this app for anxiety called Unwinding Anxiety, where we could give people short bite-sized pieces of mindfulness training, where we could give them daily modules that would link to mindfulness practices, teach them how their minds work. We could use these short animations, as you just saw, to drive some of the key points home. And of course, importantly, have in the moment exercises that people could use in the moment they start to worry or start to get caught up in an anxiety habit loop. Also, as a researcher, we could embed some tools to track the progress and test how well these programs work. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the science, because I think it's helpful to know, there are gazillion apps out there. Very, very, very few of them have any science behind them. And that's kind of the way that we start, is we start with a scientific premise, with a theory, and then test to see how well it works. So we started actually with anxious physicians, a lot of anxious physicians out there, a lot of burnt out physicians. So we gave them the Unwinding Anxiety app and looked to see if their anxiety would reduce over 3 months. We used this, what's called the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7. It's a 7-item validated measure of anxiety. As you can see here from the scoring, basically anything above 10 puts somebody in the realm of generalized anxiety disorder. So moderate to severe anxiety is actually pretty significant. And you can see all these folks had moderate to severe anxiety at baseline, but within 1 to 3 months, we saw a 57% reduction in anxiety. So that was really encouraging to us. We also looked at burnout, even though we hadn't mentioned burnout in the app, but we know what we actually measured in this study at baseline, that anxiety and burnout, certain aspects of burnout are highly correlated. And we could get up to a 50% reduction in certain aspects of burnout, like callousness toward patients, simply by helping people work with related things like anxiety. Now, this is a relatively small study. It didn't have a control group, so we got some funding from the National Institutes of Health to look at anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder. And here you can see relatively high anxiety scores at baseline. Folks had to kind of screen in above a 10, I believe. And within 1 month, we saw a significant reduction in the active group. And within 2 months, we saw an even larger decrease. This was a 67% reduction in anxiety. If you remember from the beginning of the talk, with medications, the number needed to treat is 5.2. So about 1 in 5 patients benefits from medication. Here, the number needed to treat was only 1.6. So that was also very, very encouraging for us. The hallmark of science is replication. So we want to do another study. And I've in particular seen a lot of anxiety contributing to insomnia. in my patients where they put their head on the pillow and then their mind starts racing, and then they look at the clock and they get even more anxious. They're not getting to sleep. So we did another study funded by the NIH, where we wanted to see if this Unwinding Anxiety program could help people with sleep problems, where anxiety was contributing to sleep difficulties like insomnia. And here we found, just looking at their anxiety scores, we could see a significant reduction in anxiety within 2 months, just like our last study. But here you can see, well, the control group, they caught up with the active group. What's going on? Well, at 2 months, we did what we basically thought of as a replication study, where we gave the comparison group, the control that got treatment as usual, we gave them the app to see if we could replicate this reduction. And indeed, we saw that. And we could also see that the active group maintained their gains. So that was really encouraging for us to see that the folks that got the mindfulness training reduced anxiety within 2 months. They kept their gains at 4 months, and the control group could basically catch up to them within 2 months. Well, how about their sleep? So we looked at some of the NIH measures of anxiety in sleep. There are actually some specific ones that talk about worry that interfere with sleep. Here again, we saw at 2 months a significant reduction in worry interfering with sleep in the active group. Then we gave the control group that same intervention, and they caught up within 2 months. So that was really encouraging that we now have 3 clinical trials suggesting that targeting anxiety as a habit loop can actually help people with their anxiety and even related things like insomnia. So I'll just finish in the next couple of minutes just talking about some of the neuroscience related to anxiety, and we can see how all of these things link together. So there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, and there are 2 hubs, 2 main parts of the default mode network: the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex here. Now, this is involved in self-referential processing. When we worry about the future, for example, the more we worry, the more these 2 hubs of the default mode network get activated, shown here in these orange blobs. So the more we get worried, the more we get caught up in these habit loops, and the more our brain kind of gets frozen in this oh no process. Now, interestingly, about 10 years ago, my lab had done some research with experienced meditators, looking at their brain activity when they were meditating compared to novices, people who hadn't learned to meditate before. We just taught them to meditate the morning of their study. And what we found was shown here in blue. These 2 main hubs of the default mode network are deactivated in experienced meditators, meaning that novices, they activate this network at baseline, and even when they're trying to meditate. But experienced meditators, their brains actually relax a little bit, if you want to think of it that way, and this network goes quiet. Now, we can even line this up even more directly, where we can use what's called real-time neurofeedback, where we can give people feedback from their own brains in real time while they're meditating. So we can line up their subjective experience of anxiety or meditation or whatever with brain activity. This is a really important thing to do to make sure that we know exactly what's happening as compared to just, and that it is lining up with their subjective experience, as compared to just assuming that we know, oh, because that brain region lights up, this must be happening in their experience. We were lucky enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out on camera for a piece that he did on 60 Minutes a couple of years ago. So you can actually see what this looks like in real time.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So just to bring this together, what we can start to notice, and even just being aware of this can be really helpful, is that negative emotions like anxiety can trigger all sorts of coping behaviors. We worry, we stress eat, we turn to cigarettes or alcohol, all sorts of things that actually lead just to temporary relief and then feed back and drive this cycle so that we get stuck in it. What our research suggests is that we might actually be able to tap into awareness itself as what I think of as a bigger, better offer, something that our brain will prefer so that we'll naturally start to move in that direction. And to this, I turn back to Einstein, who said, I have no special talents, I'm only passionately curious. What this suggests is that with mindfulness training, we can actually substitute curiosity itself as a mental behavior for worrying. We can substitute curiosity for stress eating, for any of these external behaviors, and curiosity itself can lead to sustained relief because it's always available and it feels different. I'll give you an example. Somebody in our Unwinding Anxiety program said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic. And instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting. I actually felt it. I was so thrilled. So this is a great example of somebody really forming the habit of being curious. Instead of, oh, I'm anxious, what's causing this? They go, oh, there's anxiety. What does this feel like in my body? Here's another example. Somebody said, when I first full-blown panic attack, looking inside made it just melt away. I was looking at what I was feeling instead of obsessing over why I was feeling it. And this is I bring this example forward because often we're so identified with our anxiety and we get caught in these rabbit holes of why am I feeling this, trying to figure out why it's happening, which actually just gets us stuck in it more because often we can't figure out why anxiety comes up. It just often pops up on its own. Instead of obsessing over why, if we turn toward our experience, we can start to see, oh, these are sensations in my body. And by looking inside, as this person put it, we don't get caught up in that wheel. And we also start to see that these things they can come and go on their own without us having to do anything to make them go away. Just to finish, I'll highlight how I worked with my patient that I described at the beginning. He had full-blown panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. In that first visit, I just gave him the task to start mapping out his habit loops. I sent him home with the Unwinding Anxiety app and said, just start mapping out your habit loops around anxiety. About 2 weeks later, he came back. He was actually very overweight. And first thing he said to me was that, hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I asked him, well, what was that all about? Because we hadn't talked about weight loss yet. And he said, I was mapping out my anxiety habit loops. I realized that anxiety was driving me to stress eat and that it wasn't actually helping my anxiety. So I stopped doing it. He actually went on to lose about 150 pounds. I talk about him a bit in my Unwinding Anxiety book. But more importantly, about 6 months into treatment, I was walking out of the School of Public Health at Brown University. It's on Main Street in Providence, Rhode Island. It's a relatively busy street. This car pulls up, guy rolls down his window. It's my patient. I was glad to see he was driving. He gives me this big smile and he says, hey, Dr. Judd, I'm an Uber driver now. I'm on my way to the airport to pick someone up. So there's an example of how someone can totally transform their relationship to anxiety, whether they've had it for a year or 30 years, and really get back in the driver's seat, literally in this case. So I'll just end. I love this part of this poem from Rumi, who says, be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. So I will stop there. Certainly, we've got a bunch of free resources on my website at drjudd.com and also at the Mindfulness Center at Brown University. But if you remember nothing else, just remember Mary Oliver's instructions for living. Pay attention, be astonished, as in be curious, and then share that with others.